let's pause a moment and revisit the last verse in the first chapter. We will use it to set the stage for the opening scene for chapter 2. You see, understanding the time of year and the season of their return is very important to us. From this, we can gain insight into the culture and the religious values of the people, and even more importantly, glimpse hidden treasures within the story. Chapter 1, verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, this was primarily an agrarian culture. Planting and harvesting were essential to their overall survival. The success of their planting and harvesting was also a barometer of their obedience to God. We introduced that concept in the blessings and cursings of Deuteronomy 27 and 28. So our two women returned at a very specific time of year, the barley harvest. So let's take a look at its significance. In Israel, barley and wheat are both planted in the fall season, so that the winter rains provide plenty of water. In ancient times, the natural hardiness of barley was a necessity because it matured faster than the wheat and could sustain the population and their livestock until the rest of the crops came to bear. Since barley ripens in the early spring, which can be late March to early April in the Gentile calendar, it would be ready for harvest in the spring feast days. Well, now, what do I mean by spring feast days? Well, good question. Let's take a look at God's list of holidays, or holy days. In Exodus 12, we first read of a set of 3 days ordained by God to be kept by His people as a memorial to His liberating them from the slavery of Egypt. Yet, by the end of Deuteronomy, God had introduced Moses to 5 more, making a total of 7 annual holy days. Now, the Jewish feast days and months might sound strange to us, so I'll give the Jewish title with the Gentile, then order them on a Gentile calendar to better flavor the season to our ears. But keep in mind that these are not just agricultural markers. These are very special dates identified by the very creator of the universe, and that should catch our immediate attention. You see, these are historical events that carry prophetic meaning, both fulfilled and yet to be seen. And I'll let you ponder that for a while. The first holy day is Passover, which falls in late March or early April on our calendar. The day after Passover is known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Finally, on the 3rd day after the Passover, we have the Feast of First Fruits. These 3 mark the beginning of the harvest season. Following 50 days later is Pentecost, typically the end of the grain harvesting period. This falls on our calendar in late May to early June. Now, the fall feasts are Trumpets, Atonement, better known as Yom Kippur, and ends with the Feast of Tabernacles. These all fall during the period of September through October on our calendar. So, what is their historical significance? Well, all right. Passover commemorates God's deliverance of the Hebrews from Egyptian slavery. On that fateful night in Egypt, all the Hebrews were to strike the doorframe of their house with the blood of a sacrificed lamb. This would mark their homes to be passed over as God moved through the land to claim the life of all the firstborn of Egypt. Exodus chapter 12. Unleavened bread marks the beginning of a 7-day period in which any bread or foods consumed had to be made without yeast or leaven. In fact, no leaven could be found in the Jewish house. Exodus 12, verse 15 through 20. First fruits is the 3rd day after the Passover, and is more properly called the beginning of the harvest. This started with the waving or blessing of a sheaf of barley, selected as the best or first fruits of the harvest. Only after this ceremony was completed could the annual harvest begin and the grain be used. Leviticus 23, verse 13 through 14. Pentecost closes the early summer grain harvest of barley and wheat, only this time 2 leavened loaves of bread, one of barley and one of wheat, are waved before the Lord for His blessing. Leviticus 23, verse 17 and 18. Trumpets is a day ordered for the ceremonial blowing of the shofar, or trumpet, to coronate God as King of the universe, reminding us that the Lord is our King. Leviticus 23, verse 24. Atonement is the most holy day of the year to the Jewish nation, today as well as in their ancient past. During the period when the temple still stood in Jerusalem, this was the only day of the year that the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies and actually call upon the name of God to offer the blood sacrifice of a lamb to atone for the sins of the nation. Exodus 30, verse 10. Leviticus 17, verse 11. Tabernacles memorializes the 40 years in the wilderness, when the cloud of the glory of God protected and sheltered the Hebrews as they dwelled in simple huts made of sticks. This marks a renewing of the fellowship with God. Leviticus 23, verse 42 through 43. Now we know when our two women came into Bethlehem. On the third day after the Passover, the Feast of First Fruits, or the beginning of the harvest. They would have been weary from their travel and may have even been surviving on the last of their meager supplies. Yet the people of the city were in a celebratory mood, not just because of the feast days, but that God had blessed the land with an abundance of rain. The barley harvest promised to be great. The famine was over. Clearly they had repented. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 14. But Naomi was not in the mood to celebrate. She was bitter and tired and simply wanted to be left to her grief. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me now go to the field, and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace." And she said unto her, "Go, my daughter." Chapter 2 opens with the introduction of someone else into our story, Boaz, a kinsman of Naomi's late husband. His name implies fleetness, and he is a mighty man of wealth. These few words describe a man who is not only prosperous, but a man who's both physically and spiritually strong. Mighty, you see, is a term used to denote men of fighting age, 20 years to 60. If the sound of the shofar had been heard, likely Boaz would have been the first experienced leader to take charge of the younger men in battle. His prosperity and community standing is evident, a man who believed God and lived by God's words. Remember the cursing and the blessing of Deuteronomy? God is faithful in his words and gracious in all his deeds. Psalm 145, verse 13. Thus both women returned to Naomi's old home place. It was likely in disrepair and in need of a lot of cleanup, but it was all that Naomi had left. As a destitute widow, this was her only hope for survival. Therefore, it's a very good possibility that her return was far more than just nostalgic. You see, it was also a place of cultural familiarity, a land that she understood at more than just a surface level. You see, Naomi understood the laws and traditions that governed it. The holy God had set down ordinances that cared for the widows and the fatherless. Exodus 22, verse 22. Thus, someone within her own society might be more responsive to her needs. Ruth had absorbed much from her years in the Jewish family. She'd been taught by Naomi about being a Jewish woman, the laws of God, and his provision for all his people, even to the stranger, the widows, and the orphan. Leviticus 23, verse 22. Thus Ruth knew that God's ordinances for gleaning gave her a way to feed both of them. In her mind, if this God of Israel is the one true God of all creation, then he would keep his words. She would be able to glean enough for them to survive. You see, Ruth had obviously absorbed something else, and it was being put to the test. We might call it faith. Okay, but what is gleaning? Well, that's a good question. Gleaning is the act of picking up any produce left behind after harvesters have gathered a field. In this case, the field is a grain field. This was typically the way the poor survived. You see, in the Old Testament, God made provision for the poor, the widows, the strangers, and the fatherless by commanding that the owners were to leave the corners and edges of their fields untouched. Their workers were also instructed to avoid going back over any field they'd already harvested. You see, whatever was left was meant for the destitute. It was God's way of revealing His love for the less fortunate. In this way, everyone could maintain a sense of dignity, even in poverty. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Now, Ruth knew that it would be inherently dangerous for her to go out. Just because she was a widow didn't mean she would be safe from harassment or abuse by less disciplined individuals. It was not that uncommon for a young woman to suffer such indignities. But Ruth also knew that finding enough food for she and Naomi to survive was dependent on her gleaning. This was her testing, and she was determined to rely on the God of her mother-in-law to protect her, the God she had also taken as her own. And she set off to glean for food. Now, can you imagine the courage required for this young woman in a strange land to take that first step? Yet with the first step taken, the second came easier, and she was suddenly in a field, gleaning. Now, do you think it coincidence that she wound up in the fields of Boaz? I would suggest that the word coincidence does not exist in God's vocabulary. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered him, The Lord bless thee. Now, Boaz was not present when Ruth first showed up. He'd been in the city, most likely attending to the offering of the first fruits of the harvest, so that his servants could begin their reaping and the grain could be threshed for use. The greeting shared between he and the reapers was also very telling. Boaz was not the overbearing taskmaster one might expect, but a man who trusted his servants to be about their work. This attribute is revealed in the conversation between he and his servant over the reapers. Then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, Whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came, and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. If the landowner had not been a God-fearer, then it's doubtful he would have allowed anyone to glean anywhere near his field. And that kind of behavior did occur. Thus, his servants would have reflected his disobedience and likely abused anyone who came near. Yet, the supervisor of the harvest, the servant that was set over the reapers, gave Boaz an honest answer and without fear. It was in keeping with the ordinances of God, as though it was expected behavior. The servant had faithfully represented the character of his master, which tells us more about Boaz. You see, a servant will reflect the character of the one to whom they've given their loyalty. Give that some thought. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field, that they go reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go into the vessels, and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Now, briefed on the newcomer, Boaz took a moment to meet the woman, and gave her a few instructions. Now, these were meant for her protection, as well as to make certain that she was sufficiently cared for while she worked in the hot Judean sun. He'd even admonished his young male servants to behave themselves. We must understand that Boaz had gone much further than the letter of the law demanded. He was only commanded to leave the corners of the field, not necessarily to show hospitality. There were other ordinances of God that protected strangers and widows from ill treatment and cheating, but this was far beyond that. This was a kindness that came from within the man. Boaz was ensuring that Ruth's dignity and virtue were preserved by having her stay with the women. You see, working among the males would have appeared unseemly in that culture. Further, she was only to drink from the water that his men had drawn up, thereby preventing her from going astray. Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldst take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? And Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother, and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. Completely stunned by his behavior, Ruth did the only thing fitting for such generosity. She fell to her knees and bowed her face to the ground. Well, this was the most respectful gesture she could offer, homage typically reserved for royalty. But why? She had probably resigned herself to the fact that these people would never accept her. As a Moabite, she obviously knew of the judgment against her people by the God of the Israelites. Yet she had promised. She'd vowed to care for Naomi, and no matter what happened, she was determined to do what her heart demanded. Now this man was extending a kindness that she could never have anticipated. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, unto whose wings thou art come to trust. Then she said, Let me find favor in thy sight, my Lord, for that thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoken friendly unto thine handmaid, though I be not like unto one of thine handmaidens. Boaz had heard about the women. No doubt every wife had already told a neighbor, who told a friend, who had filled in their husband with all the details. This may have been how it happened. Yet, as a respected member of the community, it would have been fitting for Boaz to have been made aware of any newcomers to the village. He'd learned of the tragedies of Naomi's life, and how one of the daughters-in-law had chosen to return with her and care for her. In this way, God was keeping his promise to Abraham. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Genesis 12, verse 3. Ruth's kindness was being rewarded. And Boaz said unto her, At mealtime come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, and he reached her parched corn, and she did eat, and was sufficed, and left. Boaz was not finished. When mealtime came, he instructed her to come and sit with his servants, and to join in the meal. Now, understanding that this was the period of unleavened bread, the morsel she was invited to dip in the vinegar would have been flat bread made without yeast. The corn, in the King James translation, is actually kernels of barley grain, roasted over a small fire. To our ears, vinegar would not seem to be a very good choice of condiments. However, let's look at the liquid of that day. Now, vinegar in the Old Testament Hebrew is pronounced chometz, meaning pungent or fermented. It was nothing more than sour wine that had been exposed to the air so long that it turned to acetic acid and water, what we call vinegar. Vinegar alone is far too strong to be very enjoyable, but when diluted with water or added to certain other liquids, it can form a drink or a dip greatly relished by the ancients. Wine in Ruth's day was made primarily from grapes. Thus, the vinegar was made from the fermented liquid of the fruit of the vine. And since refrigeration wasn't even in the vocabulary of that day, vinegar would have been plentiful. But where did they get the yeast necessary to cause the initial fermentation? Well, that's easy enough. When you get a chance to look at fresh grapes still hanging on a grapevine, notice the frosty look on the skin of the grape. That's natural yeast. This was Cooking 101 in Ruth's day. You see, yeast is found naturally all around us, in the air. By exposing a mixture of flour, water, and sugar, they may have used honey, to the air for a period of time, yeast would settle and leaven the flour mixture, causing it to puff up or ferment. This could take up to a week, so don't think it happened overnight. Well, once the yeast had done its work, the dough was punched down and kneaded, then saved in a cloth-covered bowl as a starter dough. The woman would pinch off a portion of the starter dough and add more flour to it and allow that to rise before baking it. The bowl of starter dough would then be refreshed with more flour and water, then covered and reserved for later use. So you see, when Moses and the Hebrews were preparing to depart Egypt on the night of the first Passover, there wasn't enough time to allow the dough to rise. It was to be made in haste with fresh flour and water. Therefore it was baked quickly and remained unleavened. And when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, Let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. And let fall also some handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. After Ruth had gone back to her work, Boaz gave his servants a few more orders. They were to intentionally allow her to glean, even among the sheaves, meaning within the field, not just at the edges or the corners. This was very unusual. Further, they were to occasionally drop good stalks of barley for her to gather. And at no time were they to stop her. Now, being a Gentile, Ruth probably didn't know that there were limitations to where she could glean. So the efforts of Boaz and his servants likely went unnoticed. So she gleaned in the field until even, and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she brought forth and gave her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. Ruth gleaned all day in the field, and then beat the heads of barley on a hard surface to separate the kernels from the stalk, then the grain from the chaff. She carefully collected each tiny morsel, filling a measure nearing an ephah. An ephah is a Hebrew dry measure equaling about a bushel. Not bad for one day's work, especially when gleaning. When she returned home to Naomi, she shared with the elder woman the parched grains that she'd saved from the midday meal. Knowing that Naomi would be hungry, these roasted kernels would give the elder woman much-needed strength. And her mother-in-law said unto her, Where hast thou gleaned today? And where wroughtst thou? Blessed be he that did take knowledge of thee. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she'd wrought, and said, Well, the man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. Naomi was amazed. She saw the huge amount of grain brought home by her daughter-in-law and immediately recognized that something was amiss. Gleaning should never have produced this much grain. Can you imagine the expression on the face of the elder woman? This in no way implies that Naomi suspected Ruth of improper behavior, but that someone had taken pity on the widow and shown charity. Yet Naomi wanted to know who was their benefactor. She even invoked a blessing over the unknown person for showing such kindness. Well, Ruth answered, Boaz. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is a near kinsman unto us, one of our next kinsmen. And Ruth the Moabitess said, Well, he said unto me also, Thou shalt keep fast by my young men, until they have ended all my harvest. Well, here is where I believe an exclamation mark would have been very appropriate. Picture in your mind the sudden enthusiastic outburst of the old woman. Blessed be he of the Lord, she had shouted. Then, maybe seeing a concerned expression on Ruth's face, she quickly explained her joy. "The man is a kinsman. He's a member of Elimelech's family." Well, it's not known if Ruth understood fully the ramifications of such a claim, but it's very clear that she picked up on the older woman's change of demeanor. Naomi suddenly had a little glimmer of hope, a positive sign. So Ruth told her that the man also had instructed her to glean only in his fields. And Naomi said unto Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens, that they meet thee not in any other field." So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of the barley harvest and of wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. One can almost see the joy and relief in the face of the women. Naomi reassured and encouraged Ruth that his instructions were good and could be trusted. This would mean that they would have plenty to eat, and Naomi could begin putting aside for the coming winter months when little was available. She may even have thought that there could be enough to trade a small portion of the grain for the oil for the lamp, or perhaps a start of wool or flax for clothing. Naomi may have begun to hope again. And so Ruth did as she was instructed, a Gentile working among the Israelites. She gleaned during the barley harvest and on through the end of the wheat harvest, thriving with her mother-in-law.